kind of wisdom can such a person find for himself under the influence of the chemical?
Well, I have to use the example of the microscope. 300 years ago, if I were to say, do you know that there's a level of energy around us which is invisible, but which is powerful and beautiful and has all sorts of meanings, you think I was a nut or a pariah, and I'd be lucky to stay out of jail as I am today. The same thing is true of LSD. LSD is like a microscope, even an electron microscope, which opens up awareness of energies which are there. There's nothing miraculous or mysterious about LSD. It opens up energies which are there, and I think will be used in the future as a form of education, as a form of self-growth. In any situation where we now use our symbolic mind, the microscope of LSD will help us see more, see faster, and see deeper.
Characterized by immense political and social advances, the 1960s became a time centered around change. The assassination of revolutionary leaders on the political and civil rights fronts contributed to an overall unrest within the United States, primarily stemming from the war in Vietnam. The rift between what the American public thought was happening and what was actually taking place grew, and with it a distrust in the American government. New technology in warfare emerged, adding further brutality to an already ambiguous and gruesome war. A confused American public struggled with a new type of war, one that was not black and white, one where citizens were mistaken for enemies, and one whose motives seemed purely political. Meanwhile, a large youth movement emerged whose philosophy centered around an open defiance to a seemingly useless war. This movement became known as the counterculture, or the hippie movement, and its members rallied around traditionally outcast figures, musicians, poets, and writers, in an effort that changed the process of American thought. Harvard, 1959. Timothy Leary, graduate of the United States Military Academy, master's at Washington State, and doctorate in psychology from the University of California, is serving as a lecturer on psychology. Following from his early career at the Military Academy, Leary's rejection of the norm seeps into his lecturing career, coming to a head in the beginnings of his experiments involving psychedelic substances. Leary's foray into psychedelic drugs began on a 1960 trip to Mexico, in which he first ingested psychedelic mushrooms. Leary's experience in Mexico would forever change him and his career. Relating his experience, Leary claimed that he had learned more about his brain and its possibilities, and more about psychology, in 5 hours, than he had in his preceding 15 years of research in psychology. With such a profound experience under the influence of psychedelics, Leary set off to pursue further education within the realm of chemicals. His realization that one could experience alternate realities and situations with new insight would influence his later advocacy for the highly psychoactive LSD. Upon returning to Harvard, Leary set in motion a plan for a research program revolving around the psychological effects of psychedelics, namely psilocybin. Recruiting fellow Harvard employee Richard Albert, who later became known as Baba Ram Das, Leary began what was named the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Leary even wrote to writer Aldous Huxley, who agreed to be a part of his research. Having established this project, Leary began distributing mushrooms to friends, colleagues, and students, all for the sake of his research. This uninhibited, drug-fueled experiment began to lose credit with the Harvard community as others began to notice a lack of scientific principles in Leary's efforts. Eventually, this doubt led to the termination of Leary and his colleague, Albert. Leary, however, had only just begun his career, and fueled by an optimistic fervor as to the possibilities within psychedelics, Leary continued experimenting with psilocybin. Upon being fired from Harvard, Leary moved with Albert and his family to Millbrook, New York, into a large mansion. Millbrook would be the site of much partying and eventually raids. While at Millbrook, Leary co-wrote The Psychedelic Experience with Albert and Ralph Metzner, whose contents were based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Leary remained intent on sharing his ideas with others, and the 1966 founding of the League for Spiritual Discovery marked the beginning of Leary's venture as a public figure as an advocate for the spiritual use of LSD and the philosophy associated with it. After FBI raids forced Leary to abandon Millbrook, he began a tour of colleges presenting The Death of the Mind, a performance intended to simulate the LSD experience.
Who controls the media? It programs your brain.
Marshall McLuhan said, change the language, and you change the universe.
In 1965, Timothy Leary and his daughter were on their way back into the country following a visit to Mexico. During the border search, Leary's daughter was caught with marijuana. Leary claimed the drug as his, and he was arrested. He was sentenced to 30 years in jail, received a $30,000 fine, and he had to receive psychiatric help. In his appeal, Leary demonstrated that the Marijuana Tax Act violated the Fifth Amendment, for it forced self-incrimination. The Supreme Court agreed, and a few years later, Leary received 20 years for possession of less than an ounce of marijuana. Upon going to prison, the convicted are given a psych test to determine under what conditions they are best kept. Leary, who had designed the test himself, answered them in a way so he would be sent to a minimum security prison. He and his wife were smuggled out of the United States into Algeria with the help of the weathered underground. After traveling through several countries, the government caught up to him and he was extradited to the U.S. During his mix-up with the law, Leary continued to advocate the use of psychedelics as a means to reach alternate realities and states of being. He coined a philosophy based around 8 states of consciousness, some which are accessed by people within their lifetimes they reach different ages, but still others required spiritual quests to attain, such that through yoga, meditation, or even the ingestion of drugs, one could attain new levels of experience and consciousness. The idea that one could expand beyond normal existence through the use of chemicals hit home for the counterculture, where LSD and marijuana were commonplace. To suggest that there was spiritual fulfillment to be had in these drugs allowed for a revolutionary shift in the ways in which many derive meaning. There were elements of truth in what Leary preached, and as such, many were able to subscribe to his philosophy. Still, Leary's pro-drug spirituality was easily misinterpreted and abused by those who sought the pure physical benefits of substances. The counterculture scene had grown and expanded by the late 1960s, and Leary was emerging as the quasi-leader of the counterculture movement. His ideas saturated counterculture thought, and his slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," became the motto for a generation of drug-influenced rebellion. The legal ban on LSD, and the already illegal status of marijuana, however, made Leary's followers and any member of the drug-using counterculture targets for law enforcement and the rest of law-abiding society. Instances involving drug overdoses and suicides while under the influences of illicit substances fast became the main stories associated with the hippie culture, and characters like Charles Manson replaced prophets like John Lennon as leaders at the head of the counterculture. Organizations like the Weather Underground, whose radically left ideas were executed in often violent ways, came to the forefront, replacing their peaceful brethren. What had once been a peaceful movement had fast become labeled as a dangerously radical one, run by outlaws, murderers, and drug addicts. Leary continued to write even while imprisoned, and he was eventually released in 1976. He toured with fellow ex-con G. Gordon Liddy, lecturing across America, and continued to write books, ranging on topics from space travel to death. Whether or not Leary's impression on America was a good one or not is debatable, but his ideas radically influenced the nature of the counterculture in America, and in turn, all of America. Timothy Leary was an undoubtedly influential figure, deviant philosopher, acid-head intellectual, alcoholic military reject, and a man who above all represents his times almost more than any other.